The auction notice had been posted for 3 weeks before anyone bothered to bid on it. 55 acres of tangled Appalachian hillside in eastern Kentucky that the county listed simply as overgrown, unimproved, and heavily infested with poison ivy, a description so unappealing that even the land speculators who usually circled tax-delinquent properties like vultures had passed it over without a second glance. Ruth and Calloway saw the listing pinned to the corkboard outside the county clerk's office on a Tuesday morning in early April, the paper curling at the edges from humidity, and something about the sheer hopelessness of the description made her stop walking. She was 34 years old, recently widowed after her husband's heart gave out in a soybean field 2 summers prior, and she was down to her last $400 after selling off most of what the bank hadn't already claimed. She did not have a plan beyond survival, and survival, she had learned, sometimes meant looking twice at the things everyone else walked past. The auction itself was almost embarrassingly quiet, held in a stuffy back room of the courthouse with maybe 6 people in attendance, most of them there for other properties on the docket. When the auctioneer called the 55 acres, there was a long pause, someone coughed, and Ruth without entirely deciding to, raised her hand and said $100. Nobody countered. The gavel came down at $121 after fees, and just like that, she owned more land than her family had ever owned in 3 generations of tenant farming, land that, according to the county records, had not been visited by its previous absentee owner in over 20 years and had reverted to the wild so thoroughly that even the old logging road leading into it had vanished beneath a decade of blackberry bramble and poison ivy so dense it formed walls higher than a man's head in places. Her neighbors in the small town of Persimmon Hollow did not hide their amusement when word got around. Old Mac Pruitt, who ran the feed store and had opinions about everything, told her flatly that she had bought herself 55 acres of misery, that poison ivy that thick meant the soil was likely poor and waterlogged, that nothing worth having grew where poison ivy took over so completely, and that she would spend more money clearing it than the land itself was worth. Ruth listened politely, the way she had learned to listen to men who assumed their confidence was the same thing as knowledge, and said nothing, because she had already decided that the land, whatever secrets or disappointments it held, was hers to discover on her own terms. She did not have money for clearing equipment or hired labor, so she did what generations of hill women before her had done when faced with land too wild for machines. She turned to goats. She traded what remained of her husband's tools, things she could no longer use anyway, for 6 scrappy boar-crossed does and 1 stubborn brown and white billy goat with a chipped horn and a personality that suggested he had never once in his life taken orders from anyone. She built a rough pen near the property's edge, close enough to the gravel road that she could still walk into town for supplies, and she let the goats loose on the poison ivy with the simple faith of someone who had read that goats could eat almost anything and did not much care whether that faith was well-placed or foolish. The first weeks were slow, unglamorous work, mending fence with wire scavenged from an old collapsed barn near the road, learning the goat's particular stubbornness, developing a rash on her forearms from her own carelessness around the ivy before she learned to move around it the way the animals did without concern. But within a month, something remarkable became visible from the road that had not been visible in 20 years, a shape in the greenery that was too regular, too deliberate, to be natural, a rectangular clearing pushing through where the goats had eaten back the thickest tangle of vines along what looked like it had once been a footpath. Ruth followed the goats deeper onto her own land than she had yet dared to go, past the section nearest the road that she had assumed was the extent of anything usable, and found herself standing before the collapsed but unmistakable frame of an old log structure, its roof caved in on one side, its walls swallowed nearly to the eaves in ivy and wild grapevine. A stone chimney still standing with stubborn defiance against decades of weather. It was, she realized with a slow chill running down her spine, an entire homestead, hidden so completely beneath the overgrowth that even the county surveyors who had walked the property line years before to confirm its boundaries had apparently never noticed it, or had noted it and let the information die quietly in some forgotten file. Over the following weeks, as the goats continued their steady work and Ruth herself began carefully clearing paths by hand with heavy gloves and a borrowed machete, more of the homestead revealed itself piece by piece like a photograph developing in a darkroom. There was the main cabin itself, small but solidly built from hand-hewn logs, clearly older than anything currently standing in Persimmon Hollow, its style suggesting construction sometime in the early to mid-1800s. Behind it stood the crumbling remains of a springhouse built directly over a small stone-lined spring that, remarkably, still ran clear and cold despite the neglect. And beyond that, half collapsed but still recognizable, a root cellar dug into the hillside. Its wooden door long rotted away, but its stone walls intact enough that Ruth could climb down inside with a lantern and find shelves still holding the ghostly outlines of mason jars. Their contents long since turned to unidentifiable sediment, their glass miraculously unbroken after what must have been a century of stillness. Word of the discovery spread through Persimmon Hollow faster than any harvest gossip, and soon Ruth found herself receiving visits she had not asked for. Historians from the county seat, a professor from the state university who specialized in Appalachian settlement patterns, and eventually a quiet, careful woman named Dr. Louise Fenwick, who introduced herself as a historical archivist and asked, with more excitement than her measured voice initially let on, whether Ruth would permit a proper survey of the site. What they found, over the course of that summer, transformed Ruth Ann's understanding of the land she had bought for less than the cost of a used bicycle. The homestead, according to land patents and family records Dr. Fenwick tracked down in state archives, had belonged to a family named Sherrill, free black landowners who had somehow secured a legal patent to the property in the years immediately following emancipation, a rarity in that region for that era, and who had farmed and lived on the land for nearly 3 generations before the last surviving family member left for Cincinnati in the 1930s, the property falling into a legal limbo of unpaid taxes and absentee ownership that stretched, undisturbed, until the moment Ruth raised her hand at that quiet auction. The discovery mattered to more than just Ruth Ann's curiosity. Dr. Fenwick explained, sitting on an overturned bucket near the old springhouse while goats grazed contentedly nearby, that documented free black homesteads from that period were exceedingly rare in the region's historical record, that most such stories had been erased by time, by fire, by simple neglect, or by families who moved north and never returned, taking their oral histories with them into cities where the connection to the land eventually thinned and disappeared. What Ruth had inadvertently preserved, by nothing more than her own stubborn poverty and a herd of goats with an appetite for poison ivy, was a piece of history that might otherwise have vanished entirely beneath the vines, forgotten the way so much of that hard, complicated, resilient history had been forgotten across Appalachia. As the survey work continued into autumn, Ruth found herself doing something she had not expected when she first raised her hand at that auction. She found herself falling in love with land that everyone in town had mocked her for buying. She began spending her evenings after chores sitting near the old chimney, watching the light change over the hills, imagining the Sherrill family who had built a life here against odds she could only partially imagine, who had claimed something of their own in a world that had denied them everything, and who had, in some strange way she felt but could not quite articulate, left something of themselves in the stone and timber that had waited 100 years for someone to come looking. The goats, meanwhile, continued their unglamorous but essential work, clearing acre after acre of ivy and bramble, revealing not just the homestead but old stone-lined terraces that had once been garden beds, a small family burial plot marked with fieldstones that Dr. Fenwick's team catalogued with careful reverence, and even the collapsed remains of what appeared to have been a small schoolhouse near the property's northern edge. Evidence, Dr. Fenwick explained with quiet wonder, that this had not been an isolated homestead, but likely the anchor of a small, self-sufficient community that history had simply never recorded because no one had thought to ask the people who lived it. Old Mac Pruitt, who had been so quick to declare Ruth Ann's purchase a foolish waste of money, was among the first in town to eat his words. Showing up one Saturday with his old pickup truck loaded with lumber, he said he had no use for, offering, with the gruff embarrassment of a man unaccustomed to admitting he had misjudged something, to help her shore up the old cabin's roof before winter weather did further damage to what history had so improbably preserved. Others in town followed his example, not out of guilt exactly, but out of the particular pride that small communities take when something remarkable turns out to have been hiding in their own backyard the whole time, something that made their unremarkable corner of the world suddenly, unexpectedly significant. By the time the first snow dusted the hills that winter, Ruth Calloway's 55 acres of supposedly worthless poison ivy had become something else entirely, a designated historical site pending further review, a subject of academic papers, and most importantly to Ruth herself, a home in every sense of the word, not merely a piece of property she owned but a place she belonged to, in the same complicated, rooted way she imagined the Sherrill family must have belonged to it a century before her. She kept her goats, of course, expanding the herd as the land's reputation grew and small tourism trickled in, curious visitors wanting to see the homestead and the animals that had uncovered it. And she began selling goat milk, soap, and cheese at the farmer's market in town, using the modest income to fund the slow, careful restoration of the old cabin under Dr. Fenwick's guidance, determined that whatever else happened, the Sherrill family's home would not disappear beneath the vines again. She often thought, in the quiet hours after evening chores when the light turned gold over the hillside and the goats settled into their pen for the night, about the strange, improbable chain of events that had brought her here. A dead husband's heart giving out in a soybean field, a curling piece of paper on a courthouse corkboard, $121 she almost hadn't had, and a herd of stubborn, hungry goats who had eaten their way through a century of silence to find a family's forgotten legacy waiting patiently beneath the green. She had come to that auction with nothing but grief and desperation, looking for the cheapest possible way to survive, and had found instead something she had never known she was searching for, a place to belong, a history to honor, and proof, etched into stone and timber and the patient, grazing work of goats, that even the most overlooked and disparaged pieces of ground can hold within them an entire world waiting only for someone patient enough, and humble enough, to let it be found. And so what began as the punchline to a small town's joke about wasted money became, in the end, the truest inheritance Ruth and Calloway had ever received, not handed down through blood, but uncovered through faith, stubbornness, and the quiet, persistent work of creatures no one had ever expected to reveal something so profoundly, unforgettably human.